Welcome again to the medical student in the College of Medicine and the College of Pharmacy, whom join us in the series of lectures in the physiology of cardiovascular systems. Please, I sent to you a folder as a PDF which contains more details and a graphic presentation of cardiac cycle. Better to look for it before reading this lecture or seeing this lecture or follow these lectures. From the previous lectures, we define a cardiac cycle as events, whole events which happen, electrical and mechanical, in a one cardiac beat called cardiac cycle, and divided it in two main parts is a systole, ejection of blood and contraction, and diastole, relaxation and of the cardiac chamber, both atria and ventricle. Now we'll study the function of atria, both atria. As we said, the atria as the primer pump. We said it is like container and a conduit, facilitate passing of the blood from venous system to the both ventricle. The blood normally flow when it's accumulated in both atria, right from superior inferior vena cava from systemic circulation. As we said previously, in the left is a coming left pulmonary vein, superior and inferior into the left atrium. When the AV valve open, atrioventricular valve, I mean tricuspid in the right and the mitral in the left, due to that the increased volume of blood in both atria, and as a consequence increase the pressure over that in that the both ventricle, so these valves open and the blood passively pass through these open valve. About 80% of the blood is passively powering in the both ventricle. This is what called passive filling. And the atria contracts usually causes an additional 20% of filling. This is the last stage of filling due to the contractions of atria, which is constitute about 15 to 20% of the filling of the heart, while the passive filling is the main proportions of the cardiac or ventricular filling. However, the heart can continue to operate under most conditions even without this extra 20% of activities. What that mean? That means the heart normally, when the cardiac output and stroke volume normally is not too much affected in normal heart by this 20%. For example, in exercise, the heart can be increased the cardiac and pumping effect by 3 to 4 times. That is mean 30 to 40% more blood than required by resting body during exercise. That means this is a huge volume of the blood, not too much affected by this 20%, what is called atrial contraction or atrial kick. This is a normal healthy individual. When atria fail to function, the difference is usually unlikely to be noticed. So it's not too much clear in the healthy, fit individual, unless a person exercises too much or a diseased heart. This 20% is the important, and the patient start to feel shortness of breath and even failure. Unless a person exercises too much hardly, then acute sign of heart failure occasionally develop, and especially shortness of breath due to the lack of this 20%. But in a healthy fit individual, this atrial kick is not likely to be noticed. Now coming to the next thing in the which happen in the during atrial activity or atrial contractions, what is called venous wave. This usually seen clinically on the neck. That is why we choose when study the venous wave, the right side of the heart. Why we choose the right side? Because of right atrium is connected to superior vena cava, and superior vena cava right away to internal jugular vein. With internal in the neck we can see it, while in the left side it's difficult to see the pulmonary veins in the neck, unlikely, or difficult to follow what happened in the left atrium. This is during in the cath lab during catheterization, while clinically we can see the venous wave in the neck and in the what happened in the right atrium, which is mean what happened in the left atrium too. In the atrial pressure curve, three minor pressure elevation will be seen. This is called A wave, C wave, and V wave. Atrial pressure wave. This is while there are noted in the venogram two descent, X and Y. What does mean by A, C, and V, X, and Y? The A wave is caused by atrial contraction, and this atrial contraction transmitted right away into the veins, superior vena cava by the way, into the internal jugular vein, and we will see it in the neck. Ordinarily, the right atrial pressure during contraction increased to 4 or 6 millimeter during atrial contraction, and the left atrium usually more pressure than the right side, and increase about 7 to 8 millimeter of mercury. And this is pressure increase. As we said previously, the atria is the low pressure chambers. This increase, the C wave, the A wave, we see it due to the atrial contraction, seen more easily in the neck into the right side, into what happened in the right atrium. The C wave occurs when the ventricle begins to contract. That is to say, early systole. It is caused by two mechanisms, really, by slight backflow of the blood into atria at onset of ventricular contraction when the AV valve not completely closed, but mainly by bulging of AV valve back to the atria because of increasing pressure in the ventricle. So the C wave during ventricular systole, early ventricular systole, due to some blood back to the atria, and the AV valve pushed to the cavity of left atrium or right atrium. While the V wave occurred toward on the end of the ventricular contraction, when the ventricle, still in the systole, it results from the slow flow of the blood in atria from the veins while the AV valve are closed during ventricular contraction. During ventricular contraction or systole, the AV valve closed, while the venous return into the atria is continuous in the left and right, and accumulated blood and fill the atria by the blood. So at the end of ventricular contraction, the atria is filled, give us as the V waves. Then when the ventricle contraction is over and the pressure in atria increase, and which is more than the pressure in the end of ventricular systole, at the beginning of diastole in the ventricle is less than atria, so the AV valve is open, and we see in the neck as a Y descent. This is due to the causing the V wave to disappear, and we will see V and Y descent. Look, this is diagram to see that the waves in the neck and during the cardiac cycle. A wave see it due to the atrial contraction. This is A wave due to the atrial contraction, while the C wave is not seen in the neck really, but in the venography it will be seen. This is not seen clinically. As we said, two mechanisms. Some blood back to the atria during at the beginning of the ventricular systole while tricuspid valve is closed, or bulging of this tricuspid valve. Well, at that time, during systole, the pressure drove down into the atria, give us as the X descent, what called X descent. This is the two descent, X and Y, three positive wave, A, C, V. C is not C. While during ventricular systole, at that time, a lot of the blood is coming in atria and built up of the pressure while tricuspid closed, so that the peak pressure in the right atrium just before opening the tricuspid valve at the end ventricular systole give a V wave. When the pressure is high and open the AV valve so that the began under the filling of the left ventricular and the passive filling give a wide descent. This is due to the opening of tricuspid valve. So atrial contraction and at the beginning of ventricular systole tricuspid close give a C wave, then X descent and the V descent due to the end at the end of ventricular systole, and when a tricuspid valve is open, the Y descent. Look to these. The atrial depolarization and contraction give the AV wave, while during ventricular depolarization and systole start there give the C wave. And that this is the during systole, the pressure in atria still drove down, give X descent. Then V wave at the end of systole with accumulated of too much blood in both atria give a P wave, opening of tricuspid valve and powering of the blood to passive filling of the ventricle give a Y descent. This is another example to see during diastole and ventricles contract, so give A wave. During systole, tricuspid closed and ventricle start early systole give a C wave, which not seen in the neck. And during the systole and the pressure drop down early in atria give a wide X descent. Then during the near the end of systole, the atria is full of the blood and so give a V wave. When opening of tricuspid valve during diastole and this more blood is pushed down and give a Y descent. This is the venogram during the cardiac cycle. This is as a record, real record. C wave in a record is seen, while in the neck it's not seen that the C wave. So A wave during atrial contraction, C wave early ventricular, early ventricular systole, and while this is X descent and then accumulation of blood at the end of systole, V wave at the opening tricuspid valve, this is a Y descent. And this is what, as I said, every event in cardiac cycle will see it in the graphically. If we come to that this graph, we will see that the atria during atrial, here depolarization P wave. After depolarization, atrial contraction give the A wave. So there is P wave during depolarization, while A wave giving due to that the atrial contraction. At the beginning of ventricular depolarization or ventricular, systole, when the AV valve closed there, so give C wave. Then X descent. Then blood accumulated during systole at the end of diastole. So see the volume of the blood increasing in the atria in this line and give the V wave. When a tricuspid valve is open there, this is a wide descent. Look to that this graph again. The same as we said previously, we say that the ECG due to that the atrial depolarization, ventricular QRS complex depolarization, and T wave in repolarization. While the tricuspid valve is closed and the atrial contraction give that the A wave. In early diast and early systole give a C wave. with the X descent, then slightly accumulated slowly during systole of blood in the atria until is the full of the blood give the V wave. And this is a systole, this is a systole, this is a diastole, this is a diastole. And so it is when the tricuspid valve is open and passive filling give a large descent, what's called Y descent. So now in this graph we see two things, venous wave and the ECG, and we will see every event in this graph in the coming slide. Now to the function of the ventricle is quite different from the functions of atria. The ventricle usually a muscular and with a high pressure, so act as mainly as a pump to pump blood from the ventricle to the great vessel to systemic and pulmonary circulation. The filling of ventricle, as we say during ventricular systole, large amount of the blood accumulated in the right and left atria because of closed AV valve. Therefore, as soon as the systole is over and diastole, the ventricular pressure falls again to their diastolic value. Moderately increased pressure in both atria that have developed in atria during ventricular systole immediately push the AV valve open and allow more blood to flow rapidly in a ventricle. This is what's called the rapid filling, about 80%. So the filling of the ventricle have three phases: first third, second, middle third, and the last third of filling. First third is about 80%. The last two-thirds about 20% of filling. This is called period of rapid filling in the first third. The period of rapid filling lasts for about first third of diastole. During the middle third of the diastole, only small amount of the blood normally flow into the ventricle. This is the blood that continues to empty in atria from the veins and pass through the atria directly into ventricle. What do I mean by that? In the first step, when the tricuspid or mitral valve open, the blood rapidly push into the ventricle, what's called a rapid filling, at about 80%. Small amount of the blood that continue passing from the veins pass directly into the ventricle, while the last third, as we said, this is the atrial kick during atrial contractions, and this is 20%, as we said, from the filling of the ventricle. And as we said, in healthy and fit a person, it's not, if we lose the 20%, is not seen clinically, unlikely to be notes, but in the abnormal or the disease heart, it's very important. During the last third of diastole, the atria contract, give additional thrust or kick to the flow of the blood into the ventricle. This is account for about 20% of the filling of ventricle during each cardiac cycle. And at the period of the emptying of ventricle. Now we take a period of the, filling of the ventricle. What happened during this period of the, ventricle when a fill? When the ventricle is filled, really the pressure increase. And the start with the period of isovolemic or isometric. Isovolemic, what we will see what I mean by that. Contraction. Immediately after the ventricle contraction begins, the ventricular pressure is raised abruptly, causing the AV valve to close. This AV valve closures we hear by stethoscope as a first heart sound, what's called loop, and this is due to the AV valve closures not opening, because these closures snap this valve to close, make a vibrations in the valve leaflets and give the sound we can hear by stethoscope. Then additional a small fraction of milliseconds is required for ventricle to build up a sufficient pressure to push the semilunar valve, aortic and pulmonary valves open against the pressure in the aorta and pulmonary artery. What's mean by that? When it start to contract, firstly, when the AV valve closed and semilunar valve, we can say hold the four valve closed, and pressure pulled up in the left or right ventricle, and the volume is not changed. There is no filling and no empty, no ejection of the blood. And at the end of this period, what's called period of isovolemic contraction or isometric contraction, the pressure is pulled up too much. It reaches above 80 millimeter of mercury. This is more than the pressure in the aorta on the pulmonary veins, so it pulmonary artery. So it is open what called semilunar valve, what is aortic and the pulmonary valve against this pressure. And the period of emptying of the ventricle, what called period isovolemic or isometric contractions. Therefore, during this period, contraction is occurring in a ventricle, but there is no emptying. This is called the period isovolemic or isometric, meaning that tension is increased, pressure increased in the muscle. There is little or no shortening in the shape of the heart. The heart geometry during contraction is changed from longitudinal by twisting around the long axis to the little bit more circular. But during this period, there is not too much shortening in the fibers, or no shortening at all. That's why called isovolemic, better to say isometric. Sometimes there is little shortening of the fibers. The period of ejection is coming now. When the pressure increases, left ventricular pressure is raised slightly above 80 millimeter of mercury. And the right ventricular pressure, as we said, less than pressure in the left side. The right 8 millimeter of mercury. This is the difference in between the right and left. Otherwise, the same event happen in the left and right, but as we said, it's not identical. The ventricular pressure pushed the semilunar valve open. Immediately blood began to pour out from the ventricle, which about 70% of the blood emptying occurred during the first third of period of ejection, this rapid ejection. The remaining 30% emptying during the next two-thirds of the period of ejection. Therefore, first third is called period of rapid ejection. About 70% of the blood in the left ventricle or right ventricle is pushed to the great vessel, while the 30% at the end of the two-thirds of the period of ejected blood. At the last two-thirds period, about 30% of the blood ejected. And come to the next step of the cardiac cycle, what called isometric or isovolemic relaxation. What mean by that? At the end of systole, the ventricular pressure, the ventricle relax, begins suddenly, allowing both the atria and ventricle intraventricular pressure to decrease rapidly. So the pressure in the right, pressure in the left ventricle decrease rapidly. And this rapid decrease of the pressure, the elevated pressure in the distended large arteries, it means aorta in the left side. The aorta is elastic, artery, so have a recoil and back pressure of the blood into the semilunar valve lead to these to be closed at the end of systole. That just being filled with the blood from the contracted ventricle immediately push blood back toward the ventricle, which is so the semilunar valve, as we said, its main function is to prevent backflow of the blood from the large arteries to the ventricle. So now the function of these aortic unpump to prevent blood backflow from large arteries to the ventricle at the end of systole. This movement of snapping of this semilunar valve produce second heart sound, which is more this sound is a high frequency sound, what called dup, when hearing by stethoscope. So the second heart sound is a closure of semilunar valve, while first half sound is the closure of the not opening of the AV valve. For another fraction of second or millisecond, the ventricle muscle continues to relax, even though ventricular volume does not change. This gives rise to a period of isovolemic, of isometric relaxation. During this period, the intraventricular pressure decreases rapidly to its lowest side of end of systole. Then, at that time, during systole, as we said, the blood coming accumulated in atria and reach its maximum, give, as we know, it's a V wave, and the pressure is very high. At that time, pressure drop down in both atria during the period of isovolemic ventricular relaxation. So at that time, put the AV valve to open and begin a new cycle again. So during diastole, normal filling of the ventricle increase the volume of each ventricle to about, so that the left ventricular end diastolic volume is about 100-120 in a normal milliliter. This volume is called, as we said, end diastolic volume. We study the left side, we'll say left ventricular end diastolic volume. And then, as the ventricle emptying during systole, the volume decrease about 70 milliliter, what called stroke volume, The remaining volume is about 40 to 50, what called left ventricular systolic volume. As we said, left ventricular end diastolic minus left ventricular systolic give a stroke volume. This is the end systolic volume. So the fraction of end systolic and diastolic volume that it ejected called, please pay attention, we have a left ventricular end diastolic volume. It's about 100-120. When ejected 70, remaining 40 or 50 millimeter called left ventricular end systolic. What amount ejected? What I mean, if we subtract from left ventricular end diastolic from systolic, this amount called stroke volume. And the stroke volume, which percent proportion from left ventricular end diastolic volume? Put stroke volume over left ventricular diastolic by 100, give a percent. This is called ejection fraction. What ejection fraction is? A proportion of the blood ejected from left ventricular end diastolic volume. Left ventricular diastolic volume, suppose it's 120 over 70 by 100, really 60%. This normal, what called ejection fraction. So ejection fraction can be said left ventricular diastolic at end diastole minus end systole. This is what called stroke volume. Left ventricular diastole end diastole by 100%, so it is called ejection fraction. When the heart contracts strongly, the end systolic volume can be decreased to a little as the remaining of the blood, it will be less. No more blood will be collected. So when the heart is rapid, so even to reach 10-20%. Conversely, when the large amount of the blood into the ventricle during diastole, I mean left ventricular end diastolic volume is too much. It might be reached to the 150, even 200. The ventricular end diastolic volume can become as great as 150 or 180 in the healthy heart without symptoms. So by both increasing the end diastolic volume and decreasing the end systolic volume, the stroke volume output can be increased to more than the double normal. Please, we will return back to the graph as we said. Now coming to that, left ventricular ejection. After the end of the left ventricular, left atrial or right atrial systole, by this is A wave. This is that the AV valve closed. When the close, start the ventricle contracted. While see, this is a volume in milliliter, this is a pressure in the milliliter of mercury, this a time. As we said, the cardiac cycle is event, pressure volume with a time. So the ventricle start when the AV valve close and semilunar valve close there and start to contract. This contraction without change in the volume, this is straight. So this is what called isovolemic contraction. When the pressure is pulled up in the ventricle to reach near the 80 or more than 80, then lead to the AV valve to be open there. And when the valve open and the blood is pushed into the aorta and that reaching its maximum, here, the pressure is very high and then it drop down. They see that in the ventricle the pressure start to drop down and that the pressure in the great vessels is it might reach 120, and then the back pressure of the blood there lead to the semilunar valve to be closed and the AV valve is still closed, so that the pressure drop down. See, from that the 180, 120, even to reach a diastolic level near the zero. This is what's called the period isovolemic relaxation of ventricle. And that what means there is a contraction and 4 valve closed and the pressure drop down and volume no change. This is volume no change. While during ejection, we will find the pressure is built up there and volume dropping down to reach the volume left ventricular systole about 140. And the left ventricular end and diastole 120 or 140. When start to eject it there and the volumes drop down to the end left ventricular, the proportion, the amount ejected, what's called ejection fraction. And then when the pressure drop down in ventricle and volume also drop down, at that time, as we said by P wave, the volume in atria increase and pressure increase and more than the pressure in the atria, so AV valve will be open and start a next cycle. So we will discuss this again. We will discuss pressure, volume, and the wave in venous, and the ECG now coming the heart sound. So to start with the graphically, from that the AV valve closed and left atrium and right atrium is contracted, give us as A wave, as we said. And while depolarization give a P wave. So when it is contracted and this closed and the ventricle start to depolarize and contraction and give a QRS complex, and this is what called, while the volume is not changed there, this is the blue, while the pressure is increasing from 0 nearly to above 80 millimeter. This is what called isovolemic contraction. This period, a short period, isovolemic contraction, when the pressure is higher than pressure in aorta. Semilunar valve, aortic valve is on the left side, pulmonary valve is open there. From the open ejected blood, look to that when ejected, the volume start down. In the first third, about 70%. And last third of filling is about 30%. So this is ejection of the blood in the great vessels. At that moment, the pressure drops down into the ventricle while the volume is not changed. And that the semilunar valve, it will be closed. Why closed? Because that the aorta, suppose it elastic artery. The blood and that the pressure, when it is decreased, the pressure is high, the blood try to return back to the ventricle, while the main function of semilunar valve prevent backflow, like a pocket, so prevent blood. And the pressure also increased by recoil of these elastic arteries. So this is the closed semilunar valve. Look, closure of semilunar valve give us the second heart sound, is high frequency sound. This is the closures of the semilunar valve. And that then start the period isovolumic relaxation. Pressure drop down, there is no change in the volume, while the fore valve is closed. So isovolemic relaxation, a period in which fore valve is closed, pressure drop down into the ventricle while there is no too much change in the volume. While in ejection, the volume drop down and the pressure it will be increased about 70% first ejection and 30% in last two-thirds. And at that period, the blood is accumulated in the atria, what called the C and the V wave. And when the pressure in atria more than the pressure at the end of isovolemic relaxation lead to that the AV valve to be open and start other cycle, other filling. While look there, when they start the ventricle to be contracted with the isovolemic contraction, look to the AV valve is closed, give the first heart sound, S1. So the first heart sound due to the closure AV valve, while second heart sound due to the closure of semilunar valve. We have another sound, we will discuss it, third and fourth heart sound, which is what called diastolic sound, we'll discuss in the other related portion of cardiac cycle. See you soon in the next lecture.